Well, thank you very much, Bill, and pleasure to be back in the Pearson building with all of you. The Honorable Bill Graham, of course, is far too modest in making such an introduction because, he was minister at the time I went to Afghanistan, and his choice really changed my life for the better, Bill. And I really pay tribute to you, not only for having sent me to Afghanistan, where I ended up staying for 6 years, meeting my wife, and coming back, as you said, a much more disciplined and professional person, but also for having launched Canada on a project in Afghanistan, in a major NATO mission that has, I think without exaggeration, transformed our military, transformed our approach to conflict resolution, and to post-conflict interventions, and brought us into a new era where we know that flexibility and adaptation will be the order of the day, but where we now find ourselves at the forefront in terms of several capabilities and the quality, above all, of the talent that we send, civilian and military, because of the exigencies of that campaign. So Bill, delighted to share some words with everyone, but I'd like to start out by asking for a round of applause for you and your leadership through that time. Mesdames et messieurs, ladies and gentlemen, it really is great to be back with this council in this forum. I can't remember, Julie Lindout will remember what year it was I was last with you. What year? It was in a snowstorm, so it was a different season. But great to be with you and Bob Spencer and so many familiar faces. The theme that I want to address is really Canada and NATO then and now. And I'm not talking about 1949 when I talk about then. I'm really talking about a decade ago or 15 years ago, before the Afghan mission, before the adaptation that has translated itself into a dramatically new strategic concept for NATO, and one that I think is deeply relevant to the world and to the challenges that we face. I'm going to talk a bit about Afghanistan, obviously, and give you some personal reflections, but I'd also like to talk about Libya and the agenda, the broader agenda that Canada faces in the Mediterranean, in the Middle East, and around the world, to which our commitments within NATO, political and military, are so deeply relevant. And before moving entirely away from the remarks Bill made at the outset about, by way of introduction, far from saying anything about my own work, I would like to put in a plug for 2 other books, because it is a very interesting time, I think, in Canada, in terms of our reflection on the Afghan mission. There are dozens of books already, probably scores of books by Canadians, by others, that are relevant to the mission, many of them very good. But I don't know if anyone of you were listening to Rex Murphy on Cross Country Checkup. He had Terry Glavin on, who many of you know, whose book, Come Out of the Shadows, is really fantastic because it's a hard-hitting account from an Afghan perspective. He knows many Afghans very well, about what their imperatives are for this campaign, for this mission, right up to today. And it's very important, that book resonates with me because it is so important in any context related to counterinsurgency to be listening to the audience, which in this case are the Afghans themselves. And with all of the institutional apparatus around us, bureaucracies, military commands, and so forth, we do often fail to do that. Terry's book is a great antidote in that respect. And Murray Brewster, whose book is alarmingly called The Savage War, is also very good. And it deserves that title because he's talking about counterinsurgency in Kandahar as the Canadians experienced it and as he experienced it as a journalist. I think they're fantastic contributions, and they're actually changing our perspective. Again, let's be honest, there was war weariness, there was exhaustion in our public opinion, in our parliament with the Afghan conflict. We'd never been through a campaign as complex as this that had lasted 10 years. Now we're out of combat in Kandahar, onto a training mission, but the discussion continues. And I am personally encouraged to see it continuing in such a thoughtful way. So, ladies and gentlemen, mesdames et messieurs, organisateurs de la conférence, distingués invités, good morning, and thank you for inviting me here today. My first observation is simply to say what an exciting time this is for NATO. And I think back to discussions I had in this building not too long after the end of the Cold War as a young diplomat starting out with people who were energetically, politicians and officials, energetically predicting the demise of NATO or the irrelevance of NATO or that NATO's aspirations to take on new members to reflect the reintegration of Europe were bound to failure. None of that has happened. And yes, the challenges of transformation are huge, but NATO remains as central, as vital, as relevant today, I think, as it has ever been. And much of that relevance, as you saw, Bill, firsthand, perhaps others of you, was reflected in the Halifax Security Forum, the International Security Forum hosted by Peter MacKay in Canada recently, but where all of these issues, in all of their complexity, were on full display, and so many allies were taking energetic part in shaping the discussion for the future. So it's a time of renewal and change, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to share with you some perspectives on NATO's transformation, which represent the experience of this government in this mandate, but also represent the deeper experience of Canada since the end of the Cold War and above all through this decade in which Afghanistan has been such a priority. Comme vous le savez, je viens tout juste d'être élu au Parlement et je suis vraiment très reconnaissant au Premier ministre et au gouvernement de m'avoir offert le poste de secrétaire parlementaire au ministre de la Défense nationale, non seulement parce que je continue à m'intéresser aux affaires internationales, mais parce que ça reflète mon intention, dès le début de ma carrière, de renforcer la collaboration entre diplomates, entre civils, entre fonctionnaires qui ne portent pas l'uniforme et ceux et celles qui le portent. Et on avait perdu l'habitude à certains égards pendant la guerre froide et la période juste après la fin de la guerre froide, parce qu'il n'y avait pas de mission dans le cadre de laquelle on collaborait à l'échelle qu'on a vue en Afghanistan. We had lost some of the habits of collaboration between civilians and military personnel that are so essential to operating in an expeditionary way, in an institution-building context on counterinsurgency. And in this position, as in some of my previous ones, I and many others of you have had the opportunity to try and revive those traditions for a new era. When I served as the first ambassador that Canada had on the ground in Afghanistan from 2003 to 2005, and then as Deputy Special Representative of the United Nations mission, which is still there, from 2005 to 2009, it was an absolute pleasure, but also a revelation to see how much experience had accrued, not just among the Canadian forces, but across the board within the NATO militaries who had this expeditionary tradition. Experience of working together, experience of collaboration, knowledge of each other's modus operandi, knowledge of each other's strengths and weaknesses. And in that kind of environment, one does need to know who cannot do certain things, and be very frank about that. What equipment is there and what is explicitly not there? What are the gaps? It was that candor, that habit of collaboration that goes back to the Second War, and in the case of some allies, long before that time, that was on very energetic display. And it was only, I think, as fresh and as sharp as a set of habits in Afghanistan because of the experience of the Balkans in the 1990s. I know all of our militaries who've played leading roles in Afghanistan had that first-hand experience, NCOs, officers, and many of our diplomats as well, fewer in number, but experienced in that operation in a very different place, but in a way that made their contribution in Afghanistan much, much more effective. Now, ISAF was not the alliance's first out-of-area operation, as I just implied, but it was larger and more ambitious than prior missions. And I'd even go so far as to say that it was where NATO really found its sea legs, even though Afghanistan is a landlocked country, with regard to the post-war world. One that, as articulated in the new strategic concept, adds crisis management and building cooperative security partnerships to NATO's traditional core task of collective defense. Now, obviously, we had those partnership arrangements long before the Afghan mission. They had built up in the 1990s, and some of them were used to great effect in Bosnia and other phases, and Kosovo and other phases of the Balkan missions. But the number 49 that Bill somewhat offhandedly cites is a very large number. And we are 28 in the alliance, but to have that many from among the partners, and some of whom were new partners because of the regional dimension to the Afghan challenge, that was really extraordinary. And we only saw a partnership in action on the scale that I think NATO deserves, and NATO will henceforth strive to see it starting in Afghanistan. And certainly the crisis management and long-term mission management habit that NATO now has as a result of ISAF in service of counterinsurgency has only come about because of the pressures and sometimes the despair that we felt over the course of those years when things weren't always going as well as we had hoped. And let's be frank, there was never a moment when anyone doubted NATO's ability to get the job done in Afghanistan, to actually find the enemy, meet them on our terms, and defeat them. This is an undefeated mission for Canada and its allies, engagement by engagement. But counterinsurgency isn't just about winning engagements like Operation Medusa. In fact, it never is. It's about, it is really a moral, a psychological, a political struggle because the population, even though you're winning these engagements, is living with the enemy. And they're wondering why you're fighting over there and not protecting me here. And in those early days when there weren't enough troops, Canadians were there in numbers, but we are a relatively small nation. The density of the force structure simply did not allow for us to succeed on that psychological and moral front. And we're still not entirely there yet, but obviously with US commitments in Iraq, other allies' commitments in Iraq winding down, and President Obama's recommitment to Afghanistan, the dynamic very much changed. And Canada's battle group was replaced in southern Afghanistan by several brigades of US forces. That made a difference in terms of the mathematics, the calculus of counterinsurgency. But what is making an even greater difference is the training mission and the presence of now hundreds of thousands of much more qualified Afghan military and police forces who are available to take our places and do so with much more situational awareness, with much more knowledge, with a greater rootedness and orientation, if not quite yet the capabilities that Western militaries have. En fait, la mission de l'OTAN en Afghanistan contenait des éléments de chacune de nos trois obligations. Elle a commencé comme une mission de défense collective par l'invocation de l'article 5 en 2001, et on oublie ce fait. On a tort de perdre de vue ce fait vraiment étonnant de nos vies d'il y a une décennie suite aux événements à Manhattan et à Washington du 11 novembre. Mais la mission a évolué avec le temps en mission de gestion de crise encore plus complexe, comprenant une mission pour vraiment mettre fin à une insurrection, mais aussi une mission d'entraînement et une mission très complexe de coordination avec l'autorité civile. Aussi, avec la FIAS, de nouveaux partenariats en matière de sécurité ont vu le jour, dès que déjà mentionné, avec les États non membres de l'OTAN comme l'Australie, la Nouvelle-Zélande et les Émirats arabes unis. And without dwelling on Afghanistan for too long, it's very clear what some of the most enduring lessons of this mission have been. As Bill mentioned at the beginning, there can be no success in an environment that complex without deep and broad joint planning. And we have done it with our allies. We did it with the various groups set up to coordinate our effort in southern Afghanistan. We did it through NATO, in Brussels, in Mons, in Brunsum. The command, the headquarters, Joint Forces Command, that almost no one knows about. It's not like Camp Mirage. It actually does exist. It's on the map. But it's played an incredibly important role in bringing people together behind the kind of joint civilian military planning needed for this mission. We've also learned a lesson about intervening in a country which is part of such a complex region with such a legacy of instability. We cannot, as NATO or as Canada, go to a place like Afghanistan and expect to have success in a counterinsurgency without having a policy with regard to Pakistan, without having a policy with regard to Iran. Our means are more limited. Without having a dialogue with Russia and the countries of Central Asia about what we're doing in Afghanistan. And all of that has happened, but we certainly weren't aware of the full scale of the imperative way back when we started. We've also learned the importance of institutions. We live and breathe them, take them for granted every day. Most of us have never set foot, unless we've been to Afghanistan in 2001, or Bill, I guess when you first came, 2003, in a country where there essentially are no functioning government institutions. And there were civilian institutions, tribal institutions in Afghanistan, but the government essentially didn't exist in 2001. And we've never been in such a place. Not Kosovo, not Bosnia, not any of the countries of after the Second World War even, because they all had governments in exile, institutions, engineers, trained people in large numbers who could play roles immediately within the Marshall Plan. Afghanistan's had none of this. And so we've tried various approaches to institution building. We tried a pooled trust fund under the World Bank, the Afghanistan Reconstruction Trust Fund. Canada invested in hugely and very successfully, I would say, but it hasn't been perfect. It was suspended last year because of a crisis with the IMF and the World Bank over the Kabul Bank and corruption. It's been relaunched, we hope, more successfully now. Not perfect, but an important tool with its own lessons. We tried General Hillier's initiative to place advisors across the Afghan government when really no other partner country of Afghanistan was in a position to do that. Remarkably successful at the time. But questions started to be asked, should this be people in uniform who are doing this? Should this be, should the principal advisor to Afghanistan's Minister of Transportation be a Canadian lieutenant colonel? And I think the answer was, in the short term, yes, it helped. But in the longer term, we needed to find a more enduring way of providing that support and capacity. And in fact, that was Hillier's own vision. His agreement, his idea was to have Canadians there as a stopgap and then to hand this over to NATO, to hand it over to the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, who actually on one occasion, names won't be mentioned, had promised to provide those sorts of advisors. But with the pressures of Iraq, with the limitations that NATO sometimes has on its own action, it didn't happen. And so we had to, he felt he had to continue the arrangement. And I think on the whole it was a success, but it's only one approach to institution building among a whole host of approaches, most of which have not been very successful. The two I've mentioned were relatively successful, and we still have to continue drawing lessons in that area. I mentioned counterinsurgency and the lessons we've learned about its many dimensions, especially the political ones. So at each stage of the mission, NATO learned. And under each commander, there was a dramatically new set of circumstances, a dramatic leap forward in adaptation, flexibility across the board, and often in the resources deployed. But we all agree now that the biggest lesson NATO has learned is that security challenges in the 21st century require a collaborative, comprehensive, and flexible approach. I mean, in saying those words, I'm struck by how banal they are today. We all know what that means. Bill, you mentioned flexibility. The comprehensive approach is really the core NATO doctrine behind much of the strategic concept. The threats are many, they're complex and interconnected, they're by no means purely military in nature. And above all, looking beyond Afghanistan and Libya, they are unpredictable. We know there is a major political diplomatic effort underway to isolate Syria. Canada hopes President Assad will leave. We do not see another course of action that will bring relief to the population of that country in Homs and elsewhere who are being slaughtered in their hundreds and thousands by his repressive regime. We know that the IAEA report on Iran is unprecedented. It doesn't really teach us anything, tell us anything we didn't already suspect, but it says it from a UN platform. It says it with an authority that these claims have not had before. And so a diplomatic effort is underway now to tighten existing frameworks to ensure Iran does not acquire a nuclear weapon. But none of that says anything about what NATO's next mission will be. And as the outgoing chairman of the military committee, Italian general who's just become Minister of Defense said, this is something that people in uniform, civilians, politicians have got to grasp and get used to. The threats will be unpredictable. We might have a few months or a few weeks notice about what will be required, in what part of the world. Naval, air, army, counterinsurgency, institutional support, humanitarian crisis. But in most cases, given recent history, we won't have even that much time. So terrorism and insurgency feed off of socioeconomic problems, which aren't going away. Addressing these threats requires not just military action, but comprehensive efforts in many different areas, from healthcare and education to the strengthening of democratic institutions. And all branches of our government are potentially available to play a role. We're not all across government equally expeditionary. Certainly, very few departments have 100,000 members, roughly. But in some cases, it will be precisely not national defense who has the capacity to do the things that need to be done. And we need to be able to reach to the right expertise, if not in government, then elsewhere in the country, in the private sector, in civil society, to bring effect in support of the political and military objectives that NATO articulates. And NATO is calling this the comprehensive approach. I remember we had, in Brunsum actually, a number of discussions, and then some of you may remember a new consensus between us, as I then was in the United Nations, and NATO and key allies who were present, around this idea of a comprehensive approach, which we called an integrated approach, not because we disputed NATO's nomenclature, but because we had come to this conclusion from a UN perspective supporting the Afghan government that the tightest possible collaboration among civilians and militaries, among development workers, corrections workers, rule of law experts, humanitarian experts was essential, and that we could never do enough of this coordination strategically in capitals, in Brussels, in Kabul, operationally in regional commands, and then tactically at the provincial and district levels. And our imperative, our message to everyone, which is, I think, still NATO's message, Government of Canada's message, is that we need to come together, to work together, to coordinate at all of those levels to have success. Je crois que tous les Canadiens peuvent être fiers du fait que nous avons vraiment été des pionniers à cet égard. Le Canada a été parmi les premiers pays à adopter une approche pan-gouvernementale en Afghanistan, grâce au ministre Graham, entre autres. Nous avons non seulement envoyé des membres des forces canadiennes, mais aussi la GRC, service correctionnel, service frontalier, affaires étrangères. Et nous avons encouragé nos collègues au sein de l'OTAN à suivre la même voie. They were already following it. But this has taken NATO in the right direction, and we are ready. We are more ready now. And our Committee on National Defense is doing a study of readiness, so I have this in mind, to operate not just as a military, but as a government abroad, in spite of the fiscal constraints that are very real, and that will be felt by Canada, among other countries. I hope by Canada less dramatically than some other countries, but we shall see. Now, in closing, just a couple of words about Libya. It's striking to go from a mission that seemed to go on forever, where loss of life, Afghan first and foremost, but also ours, American, British, has been so dramatic, to a mission that is now over, having lasted much less than a year, and where success, at least to date, is so unqualified, and where everyone has come home. It's good for morale, let's be honest. For one thing, it's also good for the people of Libya. But let's recall that at the beginning of this year, none of us saw this coming. I think many of the Middle East experts, without engaging in any lèse-majesté here, in this building, in the State Department, in the Middle East itself, if you asked them at the end of 2010 whether this kind of mission would happen, NATO would combine with partners from the Gulf, from the Middle East, to bring down President Gaddafi, to protect his population from his regime, we would have been laughed out of various offices. People have told me. Many of the experts confess to this, the best experts. For reasons you all know very well, they were discussed in Halifax in some detail. The mission happened. We spooled up relatively quickly. Canada was there with a warship and planes, faster, I think, than many of our commanders expected they could even do it, and played an outsized role. Not because we have any particular national interest in Libya, but because we believe in NATO, and because we believe in the UN Charter, and because we believe in the founding principles of the Washington Treaty, which require us to act not just to protect our territory and to protect each other's countries from threats to their sovereignty, but to act on the basis of shared values. And that is really what took us to Libya, to protect a population that was otherwise in peril. And that is what is continuing to drive NATO's focus on security in the Mediterranean and security in a broader region in the wake of this Arab Spring, now Arab Fall, and sweeping changes that are far from over across the Middle East. So, ladies and gentlemen, I don't want to exaggerate Canada's role. I don't want to exaggerate our contributions in any of these areas. And I don't think that our government wants to spend too much time debating principles and theories with regard to the strategic concept and the triggers for our action in the world. We're much more practical than that. We want to have the capabilities to do the right things when necessary. We want to come to those judgments with the people of Canada, but also with our allies. We've done a lot recently to rebuild the Canadian forces and to use them in Libya and elsewhere, but we know that expectations are high and that there will be much more to do in the future. And as a final thought, I'd simply like to pay tribute to NATO itself, to what this organization has become. Expectations were low, sometimes absolutely non-existent in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War. But NATO has made itself relevant, become much larger, partnered with 22 countries, started a Mediterranean dialogue, expanded its reach in the Middle East through the Istanbul Initiative, strengthened relations with contact nations, many of whom are now in Asia. This is exciting stuff. And it does represent the gains that have accrued to us all after the end of the Cold War, to see NATO as such an admired regional security organization. But it also represents challenges in an unpredictable world that Canada, I think, is more and more well-equipped to face, together with our allies and informed by conferences such as this. Thank you very much.